Welcome back to part 2 of the Top 20 Arcade Games 1975 to 1979. Number 10, Circus Exidy, 1977. A good idea is hard to keep a lid on. In 1977, Exidy reworked the idea of Atari's Breakout by using clowns leaping on teeter-totters to pop overhead balloons. The fact that the boring little blocks used in Breakout were now a pair of clowns that, if they missed their mark, ended up as a splat of grease paint on the floor made it much more engaging. So much so that Circus was copied by Midway's Clowns, Tato's Acrobat, Sega's Seesaw Jump, Universal's Circus, and many others. It wasn't until 1980 when Exidy and Atari brought it home in Circus Atari. Number 9, Sprint 1, Key Games, 1978. They sure loved their car racing games back in the 70s, and Key Games released Sprint 1. It had a steering wheel, a gear shifter, and a gas pedal, and it had you racing around the track against other cars while avoiding oil slicks. After a few laps, the track would change. I mean, literally, as you were racing, it would change. And if you enjoyed Sprint 1 back in the day and you were looking forward to in anticipation for Sprint 2, you'd be surprised to learn that Sprint 2 came out 2 years earlier in 1976. You see, unlike movie sequels, the 2 and the 1 just meant Sprint 2 was a 2-player game and Sprint 1 was you versus the machine. Number 8, Avalanche, Atari, 1978. As the name implies, rocks are falling, though they don't really look much like rocks. But this is the early days of video games where imagination was more vital to a game than the pixels were. You control a pillar of rock-catching things with a spinner dial, and as time passed, more rocks fell faster and faster. Just don't let any rocks hit the ground. Many may recognize ex-Atari employee and Activision upstart Larry Kaplan's Atari 2600 clone of Avalanche, namely Kaboom, with the premise now being a mad bomber dropping bombs with lit fuses that you have to catch in water buckets. A veritable improvement. Number 7, Frogs, Gremlin, 1978. Though it would be 3 more years until Konami's Frogger became the top amphibian in the arcades, there first was an aptly named game called Frogs. You pranced around on a lily pad waiting for overhead insects to leap up and gobble. Besides being an actually fun game, it was also very challenging because you had to predict the insect's flight pattern, your jump trajectory, and the accuracy of your tongue attack. Yes, your tongue attack. Frogs holds the distinction of being the first arcade game with a playable character that actually jumps. Forget about Mario, Frogs held the title. And the swamp background was also a new technology that projected itself using mirrors. Mattel made a similar game in 1982 for the Intellivision system and the Atari 2600 called Frogs and Flies. That was a hell of a lot of fun too. Number 6, Skyraider, Atari, 1978. This was the first video game that could induce nausea in players, which was pretty cool. Skyraider innovated by using the first fully detailed vertically scrolling background. The effect was eye-popping, especially next to other games of the day. Your mission was to bomb as many enemy installations within the time limit, and although the enemy never shoots back, it nevertheless inspired other future bomb-running games like Xevious at the arcades, and of course River Raid on the Atari 2600. Number 5, Canyon Bomber, Atari, 1977. Soaring high above the pristine canyon below, the breathtaking vista can only bring one thing to mind: pressing the bombs away button and blowing up the canyon. Atari was great at designing games revolving around gravity and trajectory. Canyon Bomber is a good example of this. In the game, you have actually no control about your height or your speed. In fact, the only control you do have is the button that drops the bombs on the canyon below that are filled with numbered targets of different value. So it's bombs away and hit those high-value targets until you miss 3 times and it's game over. The Atari 2600 version is virtually identical, except the canyon is now filled with colored rows. Number 4. Super Breakout, Atari 1978. Super Breakout was an evolution of plain old Breakout, that itself was an evolution of classic Pong. We've seen lots of variants of this game. Though Atari's founder Nolan Bushnell had conceptualized Breakout's colorful rotated Pong gameplay, he asked his right-hand engineer Al Alcorn to make it happen. Al assigned the project to a fellow named Steve Jobs. Yeah, that's Steve Jobs, who was working for Atari at the time. Steve said he could create Breakout in 4 days, and then went to his go-to man, Steve Wozniak, who indeed built the prototype in 4 days. But Woz's design was too difficult to mass produce, so the engineers at Atari were forced to scrap it and redo it using over 3 times the chips that he did to make the exact same game. Building on its success, Super Breakout added 3 new challenges like 2 bats, captive balls inside the cavities, and blocks that actually advanced downward on the player. Number 3. Galaxians, Namco 1979. Kamikaze insects from space. Galaxians set a new standard for what was to come at the end of the 1970s for video games. It was the first video game to use true RGB color, and it used it well on multicolored sprites and explosions, giving the game lots of attention at the arcades. Effects like the falling starfield in the background and formation-breaking alien dive bombers made Galaxian a fast-paced and challenging game that would spawn 4 sequels, including Galaga 2 years later. Namco enlisted American game maker Midway to bring the game to the US from Japan, and it's been ported to virtually every console in one form or another since then. Number 2. Asteroids, Atari 1979. Atari's dominance at the arcades was never as evident than when Asteroids came on the scene, selling a whopping 70,000 cabinets. A vector-based game that pitted your ship in the center of an active asteroid field. Blasting them would cause them to split into smaller asteroids, soon filling the screen with more and harder targets to hit. Once again, Atari showed off its expertise at gravity, or in this case, the lack thereof, and its physics. By making the screen wrap around, players could predict oncoming asteroids or use their thrusters to move off-screen to appear on the opposite side. The control panel consisted exclusively of just buttons. Buttons to rotate, thrust, hyperspace, fire. They opted to forego any and all joysticks. Also, clever players soon found unforeseen bugs that they exploited, like discovering how to rack up huge points by keeping just a few asteroids on the screen and safely hunting alien spaceships by shooting off-screen and letting the bullet wrap around, hitting them on the other side. Also, the term flipping the game was born on Asteroids because once the score hit 99,990, it restarted at 0, in essence flipping it. The home version on the Atari 2600 was surprisingly faithful, even though core elements had to be changed, like the vector graphics for one, and the addition of shields, and of course the use of a joystick. And as a side note, Universal Studios has had the rights to make an Asteroids movie for years, and over those years writers have been hired and fired. Who knows if we'll ever see the light of day. And number 1, Space Invaders, Taito 1978. Just the image of any of its now iconic aliens screams, "Play me, this is an arcade game." But how did it come to dominate the arcades of the day? It was just another example of a video game inspired by an earlier game, Breakout. We've seen several games inspired by Breakout on this list alone. The designer of course changed the blocks to rows of marching aliens and eliminated the bouncing ball for laser fire. The first concepts had the enemies as planes, tanks, and battleships. Even the idea of soldiers was floated, but eventually aliens took to the skies, with looks based on the 1953 movie War of the Worlds becoming the aggressors. Relentless alien marching, never breaking ranks, advancing closer and closer, faster and faster as they rained down bombs. That's what made this game great. And that music, the 4-note measure that played faster as they approached, was the first example of a video game with music that was directly correlated to what was happening on the screen. Also, at 55 aliens at the start of each wave, that number of moving sprites taxed the hardware, limiting how quick those aliens could march. But As the player shot and cleared aliens away, the machine could now easily increase their marching speed. So instead of adding aliens to make the game harder, you actually killing them made it harder. Space Invaders was the first video game to be licensed to be ported to the home. Atari was quick to grab the rights and created a version for the 2600. It was very faithful to the arcades and became the first killer app. A game so popular that people bought the Atari 2600 exclusively just to play Space Invaders at home. Space Invaders would solidify arcade games as a real entertainment medium that could reap amazing financial rewards. It earned Taito over $500 million. That would be over $1.4 billion in today's money. It literally paved the road with yen and quarters for the amazing games that were to come and dwarf it in the next decade. Well, that's part 2 of our top 20 arcade games of the 70s, numbers 10 to 1. Do you agree with the games that made the countdown? Leave comments and suggestions of what the top 10 arcade games of the 80s should be for our continuing series. And thanks for watching, and please subscribe for more arcade game goodness.